Ladies and gentlemen, this is TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and welcome aboard the Eastern Express. Belarus has released 123 political prisoners, including some of the country's most recognizable opposition figures. It is the largest mass pardon in years, and it comes wrapped in statements about lifting illegal sanctions and moving towards normalization. But behind this sudden humanitarian gesture is a calculated geopolitical move, one that links sanctions, potash exports, US-Belarus contacts, and a regime still deeply dependent on Moscow. Because while these prisoners are now free, Belarus itself is not. And Alexander Lukashenko is not suddenly becoming more democratic. He's negotiating his survival between Washington and the Kremlin. That's why on this episode, we ask, why now and what does Minsk actually want? Without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
The release of 123 political prisoners from Belarus as part of the deal with the United States is a monumental achievement, despite the controversies surrounding the deal itself. Among the freed prisoners are key opposition figures like Maria Kalesnikava and Ales Bialiatski. The former prisoners, while grateful for the deal and their freedom, continue to emphasize the need to maintain pressure on the Belarusian regime. They've also declared that they do not regret their political activity and will continue to fight for a free Belarus.
I think that the position of conversations with the Belarusian authorities must be strong. It must come from a position of strength, because the regimes understand the language of force.
For Lukashenko, this release is not a defeat or a concession, but a victory, a step towards recognition from the West, and an easing of sanctions.
I think that he is moving. He wants a more normalized relationship with the United States and the West.
Despite the optimistic words from the American side, observers point out that Lukashenko serves only one master other than himself, and that master sits in the halls of the Kremlin.
And now, let's zone in on the east-planning portion of our show. Although securing the release of so many political prisoners from Belarus has been a massive success, it has come at a price. The main condition facilitating the release is relieving US sanctions on Belarus.
In return for the prisoners' release, Washington has lifted some of its sanctions against Belarusian potash fertilizer export. This is expected to slightly boost the Belarusian economy, as it will now be able to sell potash fertilizer to the United States and be paid in US dollars. Nonetheless, EU sanctions are still in power, and Lithuanian ports in particular remain close to Belarusian potash. Lukashenko also gained something else from this deal: political legitimacy. The 2020 presidential elections in Belarus were considered rigged, and many Western countries refused to recognize Lukashenko as president. By dealing with the Belarusian strongman, the United States has openly shown willingness to officially recognize Lukashenko as Belarus's leader. Some experts are hoping that the deal signals some sort of shift from Minsk, but others point out that Minsk has not offered any concrete political reforms, like stopping repressions or even organizing free elections. The recent agreement may also stoke tensions among the Belarusian opposition in exile, as it is divided over easing pressure on the regime in this manner.
And now, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Belarus has staged one of the most consequential political releases in recent years. But this moment is less about transformation and far more about tactics. Lukashenko remains what he has been for decades, a political survivor who trades leverage for guarantees and hostages for concessions. His decision to release these prisoners is not driven by a desire for reconciliation. It is driven by sanctions and by the need to rebalance, even slightly, the extreme dependency on Russia that Belarus has accumulated since 2020. The Belarusian statement accompanying the pardons explicitly linked the gesture to lifting illegal sanctions on the Belarusian potash industry. They also claimed it to be the beginning of a practical process of removing further sanctions. In other words, Minsk is saying the quiet part out loud. The prisoners were currency, the negotiations were transactional, and the ask is clear: sanction relief. The United States appears to be exploring a two-track approach. The first is humanitarian, freeing people who should never have been in prison. The second is geopolitical, testing whether selective engagement can weaken Belarus's dependency on Russia. Washington's logic is straightforward. In 2020, Belarus controlled 20% of the global potash markets. Potash exports generated about $2.5 billion in revenue, roughly 4% of Belarus's GDP. In the 2021 US sanctions decision, potash was identified explicitly as a core revenue stream sustaining the Lukashenko regime. If sanctions on potash are lifted, the theory goes, Belarus gains its own economic oxygen and become less reliant on Moscow. But this logic contains significant flaws. First of all, the sanctions did not collapse Belarus's potash exports. Minsk rerouted shipments through Russian ports and then redirected trade flows towards China, Vietnam, and Iran. The industry survived, only now Russia profits from transit and Belarus depends on Moscow for logistics. Lifting sanctions today does not reverse that dependency, it simply adds new revenue while preserving the pipeline that now runs through Russian territory. The second flaw is structural. After the 2020 protests, after allowing Russian troops to attack Ukraine from Belarusian soil, and after signing deeper military integration agreements, Lukashenko is not just aligned with Moscow, he is embedded in Moscow's strategic architecture. Yet, Washington believes that some leverage is better than none. And Lukashenko is more than willing to play this role, as long as it strengthens his position and secures economic relief. Ultimately, the events of the past day show three parallel movements. First, Lukashenko is using prisoners as bargaining chips in a negotiation centered on sanctions relief. Second, the United States is testing whether limited engagement can generate strategic distance between Minsk and Moscow. Third, the Kremlin is watching closely and may well use its influence over Belarus as an additional communication channel with Washington. And while some prisoners have been freed, Belarus remains locked in a system where every move is calibrated for survival, not reform. And now, here to share more light on the issue is Dmitry Bolkunets, co-founder of the Forum of Democratic Forces of Belarus. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Yeah, hello.
So today we're trying to examine the deal for the release of political prisoners in lifting US sanctions on potash. And my first question would be, who do you think got the better end of this deal?
So, firstly, I would like to my deepest gratitude for Nobel laureates who prepare appeals and for President Trump who help people, who release people from prison, because it's very important. And deals, it's like economy. But firstly, we need to speak about so aspect of humanity and position of United States and President Trump and John Cole, his involvement on this case. It's help now people who now was released, and now we hoping that in next weeks, more and more people will be outside these prisons, and I hope it will also help to stop repressions. So it's about also important about economy aspect. I believe this deal is probably one step from some strategy of United States how to help Belarusian economy to restart relations with United States, because after 2020, Belarus is deeply dependent of Russian economy, and I hope it's very important for independence of country when Belarus will have opportunity to trade with many countries, and potash is one of the important products for export of Belarusian export, and Belarus is produce about 15 probably % of potash in the world. And I know that now in the United States there are some discussion that potash that they receive from Canada is too expensive. Probably administration of Trump and Lukashenko, they now try solution how to use in Belarusian potash, try to help also farmers in the United States. Probably it's deal for help for U.S. relations between Belarus and the U.S., and probably it's also help for farmers who produce some production in the U.S.
Right. Well, some critics of the Trump administration is saying that the release of these group of political prisoners actually come at a very little cost to the Minsk regime, but then it's in exchange for growing international legitimacy as well as easing sanction pressure. It makes it look like it's Belarus who got the better end of the deal. However, like you just mentioned earlier, perhaps this is a first step of trying to ease relation between Belarus and the United States, or pry away its dependency from Russia. Do you think that some of these criticisms are legitimate, or do you think that they're failing to see the larger picture?
So I don't think that this deal help release to small group, because I hope in near weeks we will see more and more people who will be on freedom. I think so, because I believe the deal is about release all political prisoners. Probably is now some problem with logistics, with some another aspects, but I hope in near weeks we will see another picture. It's firstly, and secondly, I hope that it's important probably for Belarusian economy, because sanctions is not against Lukashenko. Sanctions is against people sometimes, and I hope that for strategy for Belarus is important when Belarus will have good relations with United States. Because from last 18 years, Belarus have no any relations with US, no embassy, no ambassador, etc. And people who living in Belarus, they have an opportunity to receive visa to United States. So I hope now we will see restart relations, and it's not about Lukashenko, because Lukashenko today in power, tomorrow not in power. I mean, in strategy, in not about 1 day or 1 month. I thinking about 10 years, 20 years. What plays Belarus and a role of Belarus in Europe for security in Europe. So I think this deal also helped Belarus to move quickly from depends from Russian economy. And also I think it's very important aspect now world discussion about big deal between probably Russia, US, and Ukraine to stop a war. But in this deal, no any mention about Belarus. I think it's very important that Belarus must be on this deal as a guarantee for independence, and also about nuclear weapons in Belarus, and also some aspect of humanitarian release of political prisoners, and amnesty for people who suffer from political opinions, etc. I think it's possible to add Belarus for this big deal, because it will be big agreement between countries. And if Belarus will not on this deal, it will be a big problem for security in Europe, for Poland, for Lithuania, Latvia, because after that Putin can locate 100 and 1,000 troops in Belarus, and it will be also dangerous. That is why I think now strategy from US side to help Belarusian economy to diversify exports to another regions. I think it's one of the way how to help Belarus just to change economy and change some resources. And I think Lukashenko will change, because he's too old and his time is ending. And one day he will not in power. But Belarus must stay as independent state.
Right now, there's also some skeptics that's pointing towards the individuals that are being released, saying that, well, by releasing nearly all the opposition leaders, the regime is aiming to somehow escalate tensions within the political exile community. Is that a legitimate concern, or are they just being haters?
So I think that now for Lukashenko will be easy to release another political prisoners, because now many famous persons now release, and I hope it's will be very easy to release another prisoners. But of course, it's terrible that people cannot stay at home, and Lukashenko also try to isolate people from society, from Belarus country, and probably it's another story how to help people back to home, because repression is continue, and I hope this big deal between United States and Belarus help for people, for Belarusian society to stop this repression. Because if Lukashenko will continue this repression, it will be easy to back the sanctions. I think he's not interested in a new sanctions strategy from the West. So I think he will try to stop some repression in some aspects.
All right. You also mentioned there's a lot of high-profile political oppositions being released, and one of the names, though, that does come up to mind is the omission of Andrzej Poczobut from the list of pardoned individuals. Does that confirm that Belarus is still willing to reach any understanding with Warsaw?
So I think Lukashenko believes that Andrzej Poczobut play a very important role for Poland, and so way he tried to probably receive something from Poland, from Euro Union. That is why he now using Andrzej like hostages, and he will try to receive something from Poland's side. But I think it's a mistake, and I hope U.S. administration help Poland release Andrzej Poczobut like another political prisoners, because now it's a problem between communication Lukashenko and European countries, Euro Union, especially Lithuanian and Poland, and I hope together with U.S. As I try to help change the situation, because I hope the near future Andrzej will be on a freedom, and also I think it's very important to also back communication between people using trains between Poland and Belarus. It's because it's about people, not about Lukashenko family, about his regime, because he have a lot of opportunities for travel, but people not must be suffer from this crazy situation when last 5 years there are no any communications between countries, and it's now also important to thinking about to restart communication using airport when people must use opportunity to flight from Minsk to the west. It's also important because in other way Belarus became a part of Russia. It's terrible. It will be terrible for security in Europe. That is why I think new strategy, new approach need, and sanctions regime sometimes is not help to release prisoners. Sometimes, yes, it's need like strategy hard, but another way we need to send Lukashenko some messages how to change situation, how to change sanctions, and that is why I think it's will be help people for release people from freedom from prison.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on Eastern Express.
Yeah, thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Russia is continuing its campaign against foreign media outlets and independent social media apps. This time, the country's regulator has seized certain domains and classified independent news outlets as undesirable.
It seems that the Russian government wants Russians to only get state-controlled news from state-controlled apps in their state-controlled lives. The country's internet regulator, Roskomnadzor, has taken over several .ru domains, including popular independent news outlet MoscowTimes.ru. This seizure took place without even a formal court order, meaning that the crackdown is dropping any pretense of lawfulness. The regulator also named the Moscow Times an undesirable organization, which means that both the media outlet itself and its workers may face severe penalties, fines, and even prison time. The Russian Justice Ministry, on the other hand, has gone after foreign media and recently labeled Deutsche Welle an undesirable outlet.
The Russian-installed authorities in occupied parts of Ukraine are busy continuing the process of Russification. They recently began to nationalize allegedly ownerless housing in occupied regions.
The Russian-imposed authorities in the parts of Ukraine occupied by Russia, so areas of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, can now take over houses that they have deemed ownerless. Homes can be declared ownerless if the Ukrainian owners fled the war, live abroad, or cannot prove ownership under Russian law. Once seized, these properties become state-owned and can be handed over to Russian officials, soldiers, or simply pro-Russian settlers. The rightful Ukrainian owners often have almost no legal avenues to retake their property. They may receive some sort of financial compensation if they have Russian citizenship. This new takeover of property is seen as part of Moscow's wider attempt to carry out a Russification process of the occupied territories, replacing local population with pro-Russian settlers, stifling Ukrainian national traditions and language, and forcing Russian citizenships on the population.
Russia is continuing to heavily target Ukrainian infrastructure sites. Over the last 8 months, Moscow carried out more than 100 attacks using drones and missiles on the Ukrainian railway network.
Railways are a key target for Russia to attack, as Ukraine relies on them to transport military equipment and soldiers. They also play crucial roles in delivering relief and aid to civilians. The Russian attacks have been particularly focused on railway stations, power substations, depots and even signaling systems, as they are aimed at stopping trains from running on time. One of the favored ways of the Russian military to carry out these strikes is by using Shahed drones, which are cheap to produce and very difficult to stop. Despite all the damage that the Russians have inflicted on this infrastructure, however, Ukraine's railway workers are able to repair tracks quickly. Nonetheless, the attacks still cause delays and lead to higher costs for both military and civilian transport.
And that's all on this episode of Eastern Express. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.